The night after my divorce was finalized, I found myself sitting on the porch of an old lakeside cabin that had long been abandoned. 2 suitcases rested beside me, and I had nowhere else to go. The front door's lock was so corroded with rust that it refused to budge. I remember staring at it in the dark, wondering how everything in my life could have unraveled so completely in such a short time. Only 2 weeks earlier, I had stood in a courtroom and watched a judge award nearly everything I had spent 12 years helping build to my former husband. My name is Emily Parker, and for most of my adult life, I believed loyalty would eventually pay off. I believed sacrifice had value. I believed that if you stood by someone long enough, they would stand by you in return. I was mistaken. When I married Ryan, he was struggling to get his career off the ground. I worked long, exhausting shifts at a hospital while he pursued opportunities and built professional relationships. When success finally came his way, he promised we would enjoy the rewards together. Instead, as soon as his business began to thrive, our marriage gradually became less important to him. By the time he filed for divorce, I hardly recognized the man I had once trusted with my future. The court proceedings were humiliating. Ryan sat across from me looking confident and polished while his lawyer portrayed him as the sole architect of our financial success. No one mentioned the years I spent supporting him. No one talked about the sacrifices I made. The house went to him. The cars went to him. The savings went to him. The retirement accounts went to him. By the end of the hearing, all I had left was a modest settlement check and an aging cabin my grandfather had left me years before. To everyone else, the cabin was worthless. To me, it was the last remaining piece of home. So I packed everything I owned into 2 suitcases and drove north for hours. When I finally reached the property, it looked as though time had forgotten it. Weeds had overtaken the driveway. Dust covered the windows. The lock was completely seized. After breaking it open with a rock, I stepped inside and caught the familiar scent of cedar. For a brief moment, it felt as though my grandfather had never left. Nothing seemed different. His books still lined the shelves. His paintings remained hanging on the walls. His fishing equipment sat beside the door exactly where he had left it. The memories hit me with such force that I collapsed onto the couch and cried until my chest ached. The following days were difficult. The cabin was bitterly cold. The plumbing barely functioned. I lived on canned soup because I was afraid to spend any money. My mother called once, but instead of asking how I was coping, she criticized me for staying there. According to her, my grandfather had always spoiled me. That conversation reminded me why I had always felt more loved by him than by almost anyone else in my family. As the days went by, I cleaned every room. I fixed broken fixtures. I sorted through old belongings. Then one afternoon, while dusting a large painting above the fireplace, I noticed something unusual. The frame moved more than it should have. When I took it down, I discovered an envelope taped to the wall behind it. The moment I saw my name written on the front, my hands began to shake. Inside were 3 things: a letter, a brass key, and a business card belonging to a local attorney named Daniel Mercer. I sat on the floor and read the letter again and again. My grandfather wrote that he had spent years watching me give too much of myself to people who never truly valued me. He admitted that he could never prevent me from making those mistakes, but he hoped that one day I would recognize my own worth. Then he explained the purpose of the key. It opened a safety deposit box. The next morning, I drove into town and went to the bank mentioned in the letter. The manager immediately recognized my grandfather's name and escorted me downstairs. What I discovered there changed everything. Inside the box were property deeds, legal paperwork, and journals containing decades of records. As I read through them, I uncovered a side of my grandfather I had never known existed. For nearly 40 years, he had quietly purchased land around the lake. 1 parcel became 2. 2 became 4. 4 became 7. By the time he passed away, he owned more than 200 acres of valuable waterfront property. When I saw the estimated value, I nearly stopped breathing. The land was worth millions, not hundreds of thousands, but millions. The reason nobody knew was that everything had been protected through a private trust. My grandfather had intentionally concealed ownership. Even my mother had no idea. As I continued reading, I came across an entry that shocked me even more. Years before his death, he had written about Ryan. He believed my husband loved what I could provide rather than who I truly was. My grandfather had predicted exactly how everything would end. Not long afterward, I learned that a major development company had spent years attempting to acquire the land. Their entire luxury resort project depended on the property my grandfather controlled. Then another startling fact came to light. One of the investors behind the project was Ryan's business partner. Suddenly, everything made sense. Ryan had never cared about the cabin because he believed it had no value. The moment he learned what it was actually worth, he began contacting me again. He claimed he wanted to help. He said he was concerned about me. But I knew the truth. He wanted access to the land. When he eventually arrived at the cabin, I finally saw him for who he really was. For years, I had viewed him through the lens of love. Now all I saw was greed. He tried persuading me that we could work together. He talked about opportunities. He talked about partnerships. What he truly wanted was control. For the first time in my life, I refused to let someone else determine my future. I told him to leave, and he left. The months that followed were filled with legal disputes, business negotiations, and repeated attempts to pressure me into selling. Fortunately, my grandfather had planned for all of it. He had created legal protections so strong that every challenge failed. Eventually, the developers came back with another proposal. This time, instead of selling the property, I suggested a different arrangement. I would lease the land. They could move forward with their project, but ownership would remain mine. After weeks of negotiations, they agreed. The agreement secured my financial future while protecting everything my grandfather had spent decades building. On the day the contracts were finalized, I returned to the cabin and sat on the porch overlooking the lake. The water was still. The trees reflected across its surface like brushstrokes on a painting. For the first time since my divorce, I felt at peace. Not because I had become rich, not because I had won, but because I finally understood the lesson my grandfather had spent years trying to teach me. Patience is not simply about waiting. It is about knowing what is truly worth waiting for. I arrived at that cabin believing I had lost everything.